All right, so Bruce talked about, there was one bullet in his slide deck that said that custom properties or variables can be, the page is re-rendered whenever those properties change, and that those properties can be accessed or set via JavaScript. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some dynamic ways that we could do that. So there are three principles that I want to illustrate. The first one is that properties could be passed from JavaScript to CSS. Yeah, there's only 3 slides. I'm not going to go full screen. There's 1 slide per principle.
Oh, cool.
The second one is that values could be interpreted or mixed in interesting ways or different ways that you may not think about initially. And then number 3 is changing our thinking to thinking of CSS classes or CSS like blocks as functions that take the input of these CSS properties. So I'm going to go ahead and live code it up. So this is going to be the first principle, if that CSS properties can be passed or values can be passed to CSS from JavaScript. So font size, how am I doing here? Is that an appropriate font size for everybody? All right. So to illustrate this fact, I'm going to put two boxes on the page. Okay, so we have two boxes, one that says X and then one that says Y. So I'm going to now write some rules for these boxes. So you're familiar with the content property on the after before, right? You can add text data to an after before. All right. So to illustrate CSS properties, how we could use CSS properties here, we could replace this value, right? So we could say this is now going to be a var called X, and this will be a var called Y. And let's define those variables.
I don't think that conforms to the spec of meaningful and accurate.
All right, so that's all still working, right? We now have those properties set via our CSS property, right? Not inline. Okay. So now we're going to show, this next part is going to show or illustrate how we can pass data from JavaScript into CSS. So let's add a listener. Why don't we just create all our HTML in JavaScript while we're at it? Listener, did I have that spelled right?
No.
In there, all right.
As long as you use good variable
All right, so we have an event. We're now logging every time our mouse moves. You'd probably want to throttle this in real life. So let's extract from the event. We're going to extract the mouse position. Okay. And now what we can do is we can, because these are the data on the page is appearing from the CSS property, we can use JavaScript to now change those CSS properties. So we're going to use we're going to put the properties on the document. So document element style set property, and this function takes 2 values. It takes the property name and the value. So the first one we're going to set is the X property. And we're going to, because we want to do, this is a content thing, it needs to be a string. So we're going to create a string, but it's going to be interpolated from our X variable. Like that. So let's see if that works. Where's my mouse? Whoa, look at that. So now I have values from JavaScript, my JavaScript event being displayed on the page, which that's typical, but through CSS. So now we've got the X and the Y position here of where our mouse is going. Pretty cool. So we can use, this is using this because this content, the content property requires a string, right? I pass these in as a string value. But we can use these in different ways too. We could do, like we could use, instead of just displaying the value, we could use the value. So div dot, this thing's going to grow, and I wanted to do an ID, not a class. Not that it matters.
Why do you have IDs?
Just preference.
Just, okay.
Yeah.
All right. You're not doing any IDs with JavaScript at all.
No, I'm just using them as style hooks, just because there's only one element on the page. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the the size of this. Okay, and to show the size, let's give it a background color. Okay, now, oh, I don't have any yeah. So by default, right, this value is not defined. Width is not defined, and so there is no width. It's going to do the default behavior of a div, which is just to be a block element, right, and be 100%. And so now let's use the same. So you have the X position up here. We'll just do the same thing as we did here, but instead of setting this Y property as a string, we'll set it as a pixel value. So I called that width, and so that was X. But it's not a string, it's just a value, and it's in terms of pixels. So is this going to work? Yay! So we're now using the value to control the style of elements. So this illustrates not only how we can pass data in, but how data can be passed in and then used. So cool. All right. So number 2 was interpreting or mixing values in different ways. So I've got here either an eye or a monochromatic fried egg, and I'll let that be up to you.
I'm hungry tonight.
Yeah, it's breakfast. It could be. Yeah, well, this is a class system. Classist. Could also be a abstract donut. All right, so I didn't live code the CSS part of it because that's not really the crucial part. That's just kind of boilerplate. But suffice it to say, there are 2 divs, one inside of another, and they're both centered on the page, a white one and a black one. So I wonder if we can use CSS custom property variables to change the behavior of this from being an eye that looks around to being like one of those creepy haunted house eyes that's going to follow your mouse around, just with CSS. So let's try it. Just with CSS, that's not true. I mean, there's JavaScript that's processing these events, but the animation is through CSS. So the first thing I'm going to do is hook into that same event, document.add event listener. Alright, so I want to get the mouse's position, which I had done before, but instead of calling them X and Y, I'm going to call them look Y and look X.
Ah, that's better.
Is that more appropriate? Is that conforming to the spec? Alright. All right, so this now if I set some value of the inner part of the eye at just those values, it would just follow the mouse around, which is not what I don't want. I don't want a disembodied retina, right? Following the mouse, I want it to look at where my mouse is positioned. And so I'm going to modify this a little bit to say what I actually want to get is I want to get the distance that you are away from the middle of the screen. So I can find that by saying window dot inner width divided by 2, which is the middle, and I want to subtract the mouse position from that. What's that?
Inner height.
Inner height? You can say it however you want. I'm not going to judge you.
You just need to spell it right.
Out loud. All right, so now let's set these properties. Well, we need to make our eye move around and so have some sort of hook, right? So let's say because we're already using the top and the left to center it, let's use margin left and margin right, or margin top. So that would be look Y, right? And margin left would be look X. Please correct me if I'm goofing something up here. All right, now let's set those values. So in this case, I'm just setting it as a number, right? And it's probably a float. I don't want to do that. So we need to interpolate this again. And in this case, it's going to be a pixel value. Okay. Whoa, look at that. So it's following me around, right? So that's too far following me around. So let's divide it by some constant, such that the eye, like the retina, never leaves the eye, because that's weird. So let's divide it by 10, and now let's set the look Y value as well. Okay, is this gonna work? Hey, look at that!
That's creepy.
Follow me around. Now, if we want to get even a little more lifelike, it's not just the inside of the eye that's going to move around. Let's make the whole thing move, but it moves a little less, right? So we're going to use the same value, just look X and look Y. But we don't want the whole thing to be moving around like that. Let's just give it. Let's divide this value like in half. So we can use calc, like Bruce demoed. No, I don't think so. So now I've got the inner part of the eye moving around, but the outside moving a little bit too. So maximum, I was going to say anthropomorphic monochromatic fried egg, but creepy eye works too. All right. So it's an interesting principle. I mean, obviously this isn't something we're going to do like in our work, but it's something fun. Like if you were ever going to do some interesting animation, you could certainly use a technique like this to make some interesting animation. And notice that you're not like looping through and doing lots of animation in JavaScript. You're merely finding a value and passing that value to CSS in order to let CSS do the animation for you. So it's pretty neat.
The whole CSS, the function thing.
Yeah, it can be. So there's one more thing I'll show that would be like thinking about CSS properties as a function. So let me open up a new one. We're good on time, about 5 more minutes.
10 minutes.
10 minutes, all right.
15, you can't start.
So the next thing is going to be thinking about CSS classes or like blocks as functions. right? The definition of a function would be like some sort of a method or a block of code that accepts values and returns values based on what it is given. So we can think of CSS this way. So I'm going to illustrate this, I'm going to put two boxes on the page. Div dot, and the function I'm going to use is I'm going to call it position. So this is going to be a slow one and a fast one. Okay, so now we're going to write our position function, which is really it's a class. And we're going to define the top and the left. This is going to be an absolute position thing. We're going to define the top and the left as a function of a top and the left variable. All right, and so we can see our divs. Okay, so now I've got two divs that are absolutely positioned, and they're going to be on top of each other stacked, because the top and the left value right now are not defined. And so let's add in some JavaScript interaction. Document dot add event listener, and let's hook into the click. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing we've done in other examples, and it's only dawned on me now. I've used mouse position basically in all of these examples, but you can use any value you want. It doesn't have to be from an event listener, but event listeners and mouse positions are good like illustrative properties to use. So I'm going to say top is the event dot client y, and left is the event dot client x, and then we're going to set those variables, and that is document dot document element dot style dot set property, and we're going to set the property top to the value in terms of pixels. Okay. So let's do the same thing now with the left. So when I click on the page, what we should now see is that wherever I click, those red dots or those red squares go up there, go there. Right. Cool. So that's, honestly, I wasn't expecting a clap there. That's not that exciting, guys, but that was nice. That was kind of you.
First told me the rule was any live demo actually works.
You have to clap. All right. So right now we're thinking of position as a function, right? But we can compose classes or compose functions. So we have two different classes. We have a slow and a fast. So what if we make them go there slowly and go there fastly? So let's say transition equals all, and this is 1 second. This one will transition all, and we'll do it in 1/3 of a second. So now they're both using the same position function, but we've composed that function with other classes and other behaviors to make them have a shared behavior, but do it in a different way by composing the class name, or composing those classes like with a slow and a fast class. So just to review, 3 different ways that you can use CSS properties to create dynamic behavior. I guess not rule 1, but bullet 1, yeah. Properties can be passed from JavaScript to CSS. principal one. That's what I was looking for. You can take values, and you don't have to use them for exactly what they are. You can do math on them. You can mix and match values. Like, for example, you could take the x and the y position and mix those together to create a color, like in an RGBA scale. You can do lots of interesting things to those values before you set them to CSS. And then lastly is thinking of your CSS classes as functions and being able to compose those functions that accept arguments of custom CSS properties and compose those in interesting ways. Thank you.